up from the class? Just testing, that's all. So you guys are going to figure out in a few minutes that I am engaging, and I really want to hear your questions. But I thought, in the interest of the brevity of our time, that I should begin with a brief formal presentation under 5 minutes. So when I think about a challenge like what we're discussing here, I like to begin with the end in mind. And as all of you know, science is clear that the human community must immediately initiate dramatic, fundamental changes sufficient to keep 80% of the known fossil fuel reserves in the ground. So the question is, can humanity create the moral conditions? That's what this conversation is about, the moral conditions that will cause those companies to do what science says we must. Now, throughout history, when people of faith have raised their voices, they have bent the arc of justice again and again. The abolition movement, the civil rights movement, the anti-apartheid movement, the marriage equality movement, these movements teach us that society itself can be redirected. So regarding the situation we find ourselves in, I say to you that within our lifetime, mining coal, drilling for oil, mountaintop removal, and fracking will be as morally repugnant and intolerable as it would be to own slaves today. Now, I can't imagine how humanity accomplishes this unless religious leaders engage this moral, spiritual, economic, and cultural challenge at least as fully as they advocated for the abolition of slavery. And I would love it if one of you in the midst of this classwork could do some research and figure out how much did the religious community engage in the abolition of slavery? What percentage of pulpits heard a sermon or 5 sermons on the abolition of slavery between 1830 and 1860? There's a good research question. But now let me move on to the theological obstacles to what we're talking about here. I think they are legion, but I'm only going to name a few. So much of religion focuses on personal salvation. And what's needed here is to shift the focus to covenantal connection and communal salvation. There's ample support in every religious tradition for an emphasis on communal salvation, but we hear so little of it from our pulpits. A second theological obstacle is that so much of religion regards people as the crown of creation. That's a phrase taken from the King James Version translation of the Psalms. And as a consequence of this, the idea that people could cause the demise of creation is anathema to many religious people. For example, Senator James Inhofe thinks that his God, I'm quoting now, his God would not allow climate change. And secondly, this other problem that emerges from anthropocentrism is that if you begin to suggest that the first focus of our concern as religious leaders should be creation care, and that people is a part of creation care, most congregations will be uncomfortable with that. So those are theological obstacles. Now, in addition to that, there's resistance on the ground from both pastors and within congregations. Both pastors and congregations tend to want to avoid politics. And so my question is, can pastors and congregations come to recognize that preserving the Eden into which we were born is too important to leave to the politicians? Also, pastors are generalists. And so they're reluctant to say much about any topic that requires scientific or technical expertise or background. Finally, worshipers, they tend to want to simply feel good as a result of having attended worship. And hearing a sermon on climate change will bum them out, and it may even piss them off. So how can each of these resistances be addressed? I see that as part of your challenge in addressing this entire topic if you're assigned to this particular case. And I also want to make a note about the case that we sent to you, and that is there may be a distinction between empowering the denominational leaders, in other words, my colleagues who have responsibility for, dozens or scores or even hundreds of churches, a distinction between empowering them and motivating or empowering the local pastor to preach a sermon on this. Then I have one final observation, and then I'll open it up to questions. And that is the 1,835 congregations throughout New England that are potentially touched by NIRM. They represent a wide range of demographic, political, theological, and moral perspectives and realities. And so part of the challenge you all face is how can you come up with a document that could be circulated to those pastors in that wide range of circumstances that would be helpful, even though they could be coming from such different places demographically, politically, theologically, and morally. So I'll stop there and I'll gladly respond to whatever questions you have.
Any questions? Yes, Jim.
Yeah, of course. 1 second, I got anti-slavery movement. One big difference was, two big differences I want to ask you about. One is that we can't just end climate change. This is something that's going to stick with us and stay with us for a long time. And then also, the civil rights movement really engaged the wide ranges of faith groups. And so I wonder if you could speak about those particular issues a little bit, your vision of the prophetic preaching and other supportive things.
So in relation to the first question about how climate change is going to be with not just humanity, but with all of creation, for 1,000 years or some period of time like that, even if we do a great job of addressing it in the next 50 years. Reality is racism is still with us also. And I'm sure everybody in this room is well aware of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I don't know how much you all have dived into that, but as a pastoral leader, I certainly have. And one of the things, particularly in a progressive church like the United Church of Christ, we are aware of, slavery didn't end with the Emancipation Act. And there are still all kinds of examples of slavery going on today. So, I don't see that as a difference. I see that actually, sadly, pathetically, as a similarity. Your second question was more ambiguous. Patrick, Patrick's.
Can you repeat that?
Yeah, could you repeat that second question, or could somebody paraphrase it?
The goal is the goal is to connect with a wide range of faith communities. I guess how would your strategies around and goals around prophetic preaching and possibly other church-related activities support that community building?
So I'm trying to listen between the lines of what you're asking. I think particularly when you get into any form of prophetic preaching, it is never the case that one size fits all. And so prophetic preaching in the United Church of Christ congregation might take one form, prophetic preaching in a evangelical congregation, like where Catherine Hayhoe, where her husband is a pastor, that could take an entirely different form. I haven't had the opportunity to read sermons from Catherine's husband, but I'll look forward to it based on your question, actually. It's also the case on a more subtle basis that there's a difference between Episcopal prophetic preaching and UCC prophetic preaching. Another distinction I would say is that the Pope will be releasing an encyclical. Some say it's going to be in April. Some say it's a little bit after that, on human ecology, and it will include a substantial portion on climate change. And the question is, what will the priests all over the world do with this encyclical? Because most encyclicals, the local priest has perhaps an obligation, but certainly an expectation that he's going to speak to that encyclical. Well, if the priest chooses to go at the climate change thing, that will be prophetic preaching. And the Catholic Church has a long tradition of prophetic preaching. I guess the question I would raise is whether they will look to that tradition of prophetic witness and apply it to the climate change thing, when in fact, I think it's 7 of the leading climate denying senators are self-proclaimed, if not legitimate, Catholics. So those are some comments. It's a pretty open-ended question that you asked, but those are some comments on it. Other questions?
Yes, one over here. 1 second.
Good afternoon, Jim. My name is Albert. I'm actually from Congo, in Africa. I have one question and one comment. The comment is really I liked your topic. It's an interesting idea of doing that through the churches because they play an important role in certain places like the one I'm from. So the question I have actually, do you think the tools that are likely, the communication tools that are likely to come out of this project would be used outside the US?
Oh, that's a great question. So the controversy around climate change as it relates, or within the faith community, that controversy is, as I understand it, much more prominent in the United States than it is outside the United States. So in some sense, we have a bigger load to lift in the United States in order to make a convincing case around this. My understanding is that's not only true for the faith community, but it would be true of just the normal population. I see Mary Evelyn in the back there. Hi, Mary Evelyn. Yeah, you may have a more fitting response to this because you're as aware as anybody as to the kind of worldwide religious awareness around climate change. I'd love to hear your comment on this.
Well, great to see you, Jim, and also Patrick. I love this new joint venture. So first of all, the Pope's encyclical is going to come out in either June or July.
Okay.
But here at the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, Peter training the dean is sort of keen on this encyclical and implications for talking about moral and ethical change and equity issues and economics. In fact, that I shouldn't maybe be saying it, it's not settled yet, but he actually wants to do a kind of panel on this before the semester ends, even though the encyclical will come out in summer and then again in the fall. So I think there's interest in the science community here for sure, and there's media on this encyclical all over the place. Gina McCarthy, our EPA administrator, is visiting the Vatican this week. I think tomorrow she speaks to the Pope and so on. So, and she was very pleased that the bishops supported the regulations on air quality control and so on. So it's very interesting, things happening. But I guess what I would want to say in relation to the question that just occurred, I agree that climate denial is a special problem in the U.S., but climate change information around the world, is still an issue. And I think for religious communities to speak on this as a moral issue that, of course, affects people, affects the poor, but affects the earth as well. And this encyclical will do both, integrity of creation and poverty issues and rising seas and so on. So I think the notion of sermons, whether it's in Christian communities, but I also think we've got to think very multi-religiously about these issues. And that's part of this forum on religion and ecology, and hopefully John and I will be speaking later on these issues with you as well. So I could go on forever, but hopefully that touched on. But this is the guy who got UCC on board for divestment, and it's really an amazing accomplishment. So thrilled.
You're both kind. Let me add to something that Mary Evelyn said. As a conceptual theological thing that may be of interest, whether or not you yourself are theologically engaged in this class, and that is this business that I hinted at about expanding the understanding of essentially religion's purpose being focused on personal salvation and shifting that to a recognition, which is contained in every world religion, to an emphasis on communal salvation. If we could get a significant percentage of our pastors and rabbis and imams to shift their focus from personal to communal salvation, believe me, everything would all of a sudden have energy to change in ways that, as I said, science says are needed. Other questions?
Great. Thank you very much, Jim. Joe, do you have anything you wanted to add? We're at the end of our time here. Is there any comment you'd like to add to Jim's terrific presentation?
Paul, you and I haven't known each other very long, but you should know well enough that if you give me that invitation, I'll be glad to take it.
we have a few minutes. We have about 3-4 minutes, so why don't you just jump right in?
All right, real quick. This project I'm so pleased to see all of you out there, your bright and shiny faces, and Jim and Patrick. This project is basically coming about as a consequence of two things. One is the fact that I'm married to a UCC pastor who, for the last 8 years, has had to confront the challenges of preaching in a church that is UCC, but is really a community church. And if you look into the history of community churches in New England, they have incredibly broad theological and political diversity in the congregation, much more so, in fact, even than a classic UCC church, which has enough. So we've been struggling, Nancy, my wife, around not just this issue, but other issues. And the specific thing for her is not so much not wanting to avoid politics, as much as the challenge of trying to preserve and, in fact, build community, even as she tries to get her congregation to grapple with these challenging issues. And to me, that really is the crux of, and I think the most interesting thing about this project is you have clergy out there who I think, in their own ways are very courageous, but they're also very, very much committed to their congregations. And so for them, and Jim's nodding his head, they're torn. And so the question then becomes, what are the obstacles, the limitations, and the barriers that they face? Jim has certainly laid out some of them. But I would submit that maintaining community is a very, very key motivator for them. And so the question basically then becomes, how do you communicate on these issues in a way that may not convince the flat earthers who are still out there and present in every congregation? You certainly don't need to convince the other end. They're already there. You may need to activate them. But the real issue is to meet that great unwashed group in the middle that in the alignment model you would call the settlers, and bring them into a sharper focus on the reality of these issues and the reality of the need for some level of activism. And Jim, just a thought, I think something that Nancy and I have talked about is what's needed here, I think, is kind of a broad toolkit. Some information to build sermons around, and the notion of sermoning, I think, is very important. But there's a whole strategy and tactics piece that I guess I would just throw out would be very, very valuable to build into this. Patrick and I talked about this last week. For instance, you did a service, I think, that he saw. It was the first one that he had seen. And one of the things that came up in that was what sounded like a wonderful children's sermon, and basically tying, your sermoning together with the message that was delivered there through the music, etc. And so I think that's another aspect of this, from my perspective, is we should all be conceptualizing this as a toolkit, basically, that the pastorate can bring to challenge this issue.
Excellent. Thank you, Joe.
Yep.
Okay, so Jim, Joe, Patrick, what we'd like to do by Monday, we will have constituted a group to address this project. Just so you know what the workflow is between now and next Thursday, it's as follows. I'm requesting, as I've already shared with you, that the group, likely 3 to 5, will have a session with you in which you all dive a little bit deeper, and the objective is to come to class next Thursday with 3 possible projects that are doable within the time framework allocated, while also alluding to the larger possible partnership and project on an ongoing basis with Yale. And so the focus from the students will be to crystallize opportunities, communication opportunities based on the mandates that you put forward, present them to class next Thursday. A decision will be made next Thursday, and then after that, a workflow between the team captain and your team will be developed on a weekly and/or bi-weekly basis to confer with you, and we'll develop benchmarks and metrics along the way over the course of the next 9 weeks to make sure that we all stay on course and deliver an outcome that's doable and beneficial and achievable and tangible. Okay?
Sounds good.
Good. Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, Brawley. We'll be in touch. So a couple of things here. It's time for a break. Shane, did you have a question? Okay.